Okay, I just started a new one, sorry.
No problem.
I don't know what's causing that. But it's irrelevant now. Wait, why is it doing that? Oh no, it's actually she's just being very still.
You have to unfreeze her as well. You know it. You have to say.
We're good.
Okay, all right. So back again, just the header slide there. Standard disclaimer. Here on behalf of my own thing, I'm not speaking for my agency. I'm not speaking for the government. So these are just some of my own ideas. Super brief introduction. As you guys have been in some of the talks earlier today, work for a lot of people doing a lot of different things. That's just some of those folks. And stuff I do in free time. Had a chance to speak at DEF CON this last year. Actually, that was what sparked this initial concept for this idea. It was at a speaker dinner where we're trying to think about, like, hey, we've got this issue of reporting vulnerabilities to the government. DHS is potentially not the best way to do it. The problem statement here is, you have the public. It's not always going to be the government people that are going to be, finding the vulnerabilities. And it's like, I found this epic vulnerability in the federal system. Who do I call? Everyone, all DHS will do is tell you, call CERT CC. That's great. They collect the stuff, but there's really no lever after the vulnerability is reported to actually see an action in an agency. It's a trickier question to ask about that, and there's no real easy way to answer that. Right now within the government, there is very interesting, I'd say, pool that people are, I hate to use the term hissing in at this point, it's the authority pool, the trust pool. The scope is, who has what authority, like what an agency has an authority, what an outside agency has inward to another agency, and then across government. So DHS has always been tapped as the cybersecurity lead in the federal government and the executive branch, but not always has the reach into the agency specifically. Limited authority, again, there's laws and statutes of who has what authority, so like some of the like FISMA, a couple other federal information security laws that kind of put borders on things, and then you have the IC and DoD, which also have their own kind of cross-knit stuff. Again, one of the other challenges is, too, it's great you have DHS that is tapped and supposed to wear this hat, but they have limited knowledge of inside the agency's networks. So they have a notional idea of how the outside looks, that crunchy outside, and not so much the chewy center. Part of the continuous diagnostics and mitigation program known as CEM is an attempt to kind of tease that information out, but right now it's just in its early phases. And again, we talk about government, we're in a time of limited trust. Limited public trust of the government, as noticed with all the news and stuff, but also interagency trust. So to build those connections between, say, DOJ and our agency, just to exchange case information, go through this whole vetting process, let alone, agreeing that DHS is going to have a agreement with an agency that allows them to do scanning or any other kind of assistance that they want to have. And then limited communications. This is actually some of those things you learn once you've been in a federal agency for a while, that people don't talk to one another very well. We have a communication problem. As much as you guys may kind of grind about, my manager isn't listening to me, he's not understanding my point of view. When you get up to the executive level and even trying to talk across agencies, not everybody has the same level of knowledge, not everyone's using the same lexicon, and some folks may interpret you saying one thing and means another. So that starts to exacerbate a lot of these problems, and specifically, as I mentioned before about vulnerability reporting, the case where one thing is a burning hot issue for one person is not necessarily for another, and how you kind of use your language and your ability and your authority and trust to get something to occur on the other end. So touching on the scope issue, so what's everybody's purview to handle? So with agencies, they're typically operational. So you have security operations, compliance, and policy. Policies are the ones that usually, how does my organization operate? Compliance is the stuff driven by FISMA, so if anyone's an auditor for a federal agency, you're drilled in, you're going to have these compensating controls, and if you find something bad, you write a POAM, and that gets put in the pile with all the other POAMs, and 7 years later you finally found out that you eventually fixed it, or you just give up. And then security operations, some of you may already work in the government security operations center, sometimes it's staffed by feds, sometimes it's staffed by contractors. getting that knowledge shared across federal leadership to the contracting companies sometimes is a challenge, and it just becomes a general mess to kind of handle. The other issue too is much with as you look at the structure of the federal government, each agency has a different scope. So I've worked with a bunch of different agencies. I've worked for Interior, where you're talking about natural resources. I work for Treasury, so it's your financial system. I'm currently working for HHS, which is in healthcare. All of them really don't have a lot of overlap, so they all have a different way of doing things, or they all have a different interest in their mission. So sometimes with that scope is, you know, if you have one-size-fits-all mentality, much like personally the DHS CDM program has, you know, you try to apply that to those agencies that have different way of focus and way of doing business, it's not going to translate very well. So when you start thinking about vulnerability reporting, trying to do a one-size-fits-all, again, reporting to CERT doesn't necessarily work. So, as I mentioned, I worked for the Department of the Interior. We call the Department of Everything Else. Veterans Administration used to be under there. I think, I'm trying to remember, there's a lot of the micro-agencies, and some of the ones that have now become cabinet-level agencies used to be under Interior. And they since then spun off on their own. You're starting to see that with DHS. You know, when that was formed, they rolled what was the new Transportation Security Agency under it, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration, and I think actually, yeah, they moved the Secret Service under there and everything. So they just basically kind of start lumping things in there, and now the cybersecurity focus, which really kind of didn't exist as a coherent whole before, it's under DHS now, and now it's, you know, well, let's see, 2003, so, you know, 15 years on, they're still kind of coagulating into a real strategy. And the other challenge to that is, too, and if anyone's been following the news over the last couple of years, there's been that kind of revolving door. Like, a lot of the executives who've been there for that 15 years have been finding their way out, so there's no consistent leadership. And trying to drive through programs and activities that are usually pushed down from the White House don't meet with a lot of success, because by the time someone's ready to run with that proverbial football, they're just going to sit down on the ground and say, screw it, I'm out of here. Let's see. Yeah. So, again, we're talking about authority. When I mentioned before, like FSMA outlines what's each gets sent from the component offices for reporting. So, part of the rules within the federal agencies is OMB, Office of Management Budget, which is under the Executive Office of the President, also known as the UOP, usually does data calls. So they want to know, like, how many vulnerabilities you found, how many breaches. There's time limits to that. So within agencies, I think for notifications to you as sort of a data breach or an incident, it's usually within an hour. And you're kind of scrambling to do all that. Sorry, speaking too fast, my foot's dry here. So a lot of that stuff's getting rolled up to DHS and then to OMB. But as it mentions about righteous authority here, is who has the power once something's found and reported to actually provide an action to it. So DHS will coordinate response, much like we saw with the OPM breach, but OMB is sitting there counting time, examining the budget that's been spent on it, but there's really not much more than that kind of capability. It's usually up to the agency to respond and apply resources to fix it. The challenge with that is with OMB controlling the budget, and DHS responding, Congress looks at that, and after a while, if they see an agency that isn't getting their vulnerabilities fixed, is basically being a bad actor in the fact that they're not kind of keeping up their cybersecurity infrastructure, they will start cutting budget. And the typical thing with the government is that if they find you doing something bad, they're not going to necessarily increase your budget to solve the problem. They're just going to start cutting it from you. So you're trying to do more with less. So the more vulnerabilities you find and the more issues you find, and you're not reporting, you're not dealing with them, they're going to like, well, you're not obviously doing it, so you're not being effective, so we'll cut some more money. So then you just get this nasty backlog and this near unvirtuous circle of this pile of issues that you have no money to address. And eventually this leads to where we are in federal cybersecurity, which is just all these agencies with all these vulnerabilities and all these problems struggling to kind of dig themselves out of the hole. So the key thing here is, in DC, knowledge is power. you get power DC from knowing people. Within cybersecurity is knowing like how things work within the agency. And there's no common federal infrastructure. It's agencies kind of stitch together what works for them. Those architecture documents and stuff are never shared much beyond the agency. So DHS doesn't have this massive federal network map. Like, they don't know how everything's glued together. In some cases, most agencies don't know what the inside of their agencies look like. They're usually whiteboard sketches that someone photographs and returns this to the enterprise architecture person and says, this is what it looks like. And by that time, someone rubbed up against the whiteboard, and suddenly the entire segment of the network's gone. It's been deemed as part of your final architecture. Again, too, you know, the old dictum of you can have it fast, you can have it cheap, or you have it correct pitch too. One of those things is this: a lot of people pushing to get things done cheaply and quickly, so it's never usually done correctly. So one of those things that suffer is documentation. So if you got that snap of the whiteboard, you're lucky. And the other challenge I found specifically when I was at Interior was that the concept of system owner. Like, who's responsible for that federal system? Who's going to be called on the carpet if something bad happens varies from agency to agency. One of the cases we had when I was at Interior was we had a system owner who was a lawyer. Try to explain to a lawyer that they have a vulnerability, and you could be speaking ancient Greek to them. However, that lawyer also could have studied ancient Greek when they're in school, and they may actually potentially understand you, but that's a rarity. So you're trying to translate their security needs into someone who's responsible for a system that doesn't actually have a background that can kind of rock what you're trying to explain to them. So you're constantly fighting this communication battle with system owners to say, you need to fix this, you need to budget for getting this fixed, and if you don't accept this risk or understand the risk, you could potentially be, you know, out of a job if they're not a political appointee. You could be out of a job because, you know, your system's vulnerable, you haven't patched anything, and it's you know, OMB and Congress are basically saying, you know, enough is enough. We're gonna disconnect you from the internet. At Interior, that actually happened with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was really nasty. That's actually what got me into government services. That I don't want to see an agency that serves people like that actually be removed from the internet, because with that, then service degrades. You don't have people getting healthcare services out on the Indian reservations. You don't have kids being taught on the reservations. Just a really bad situation if you're in public service to actually be stuck in. One of the things we also found too was, let's see if I can get that on speaker notes here. This is actually an interesting system. So I think back in, let's see, here's the concept I was going to say. So a couple years ago, I worked in the private industry for a critical infrastructure company, and they were the oldest power utility in the United States. But when I started as a security engineer, I was one of their first security engineers. Age does not beget maturity. Same thing goes for the federal government. They've been around since, obviously, the founding of our country as we know it now. They're hundreds of years old, you know, slowly moving towards 300, but they're not necessarily mature. There's very little rigor. So some folks practice the capability maturity model, CMMI. That's still somewhat a foreign concept with people because you haven't gotten to that rigor, that level of maturity. So those processes a lot of times are ad hoc. You have people aging out, retiring, and stuff like that. And sharing that knowledge is near non-existent at cases. Also, let's see. Next one here. So we talked before about, or I mentioned before about trust. One of the things that we're trying to see with now with the cybersecurity authority within granted the DHS is to say, hey, trust us. Like, we want to come in, we want to help you. We'll do hunt operations. We'll help you address your vulnerability programs with CDM. That was the big trust exercise. Was we're coming in, we're going to show you how you can get all this risk reporting and give you something usable for managing the risk within your infrastructure, identifying operational potential flaws that you have. So, the first component of CDM is basically becoming aware of what's in your infrastructure, doing inventories and so forth. That's a big trust buildup for DHS, but also internally in the agencies. When I was at Treasury doing CDM, was trying to establish trust between all the offices and bureaus within Treasury itself. So IRS, big, huge, 800-pound gorilla for Treasury, pretty much drove technical policy within the agency. But, like, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, smaller one, but if you look at them across, they all had to kind of participate in the program, and getting them to kind of trust that send me your information, send me all the juicy details, was very difficult within the agencies, and then when you try to spread that across the federal government, extremely difficult. And when you start to automate this with what CDM was supposed to do, you have this political battle of wondering, do I want to expose that I have all these vulnerabilities, all these potential risky operations that I have in my infrastructure? Do I want to share them with DHS? What are they going to do with it? So you're trying to get that interagency, and then further up the chain, DHS is going to report that to the White House. What is the White House going to do? Are they going to use that to drive policy? You've seen some interesting policy decisions being pushed down from the current administration, but imagine this applied to cyber, that we're just kind of like, well, I have a political vendetta against you. We're going to make this agency to do this, and I have this data from DHS that says it gives me the right to do that. So, again, we were just talking about before too is communication issues. One of the things I found is the biggest challenge about my career, both private and public sector, was figuring out who to talk to about getting stuff done. You guys have informal networks within your organizations. You have peers that you work with, you trust. Someone's got your back. But are you sure that the next person at the chain has your back? Are they going to leverage that against you? So you start to parse out only the information you deem necessary going forward. So what I mentioned before about trust between agencies and DHS and DHS and the White House and agencies who may be seeing stuff in a federal dashboard across everything. When you want to communicate that up, how are you parsing that information to actually make it usable to help you do your job, and then help those people make decisions about what they're going to do, assessing how they're going to operate in a risk environment, but also in general, like, what are they going to do strategy-wise? Are you going to want to move to the cloud? Are you going to want to consolidate data center, part of the data center consolidation initiative? Or are you going to do something else? But the big thing, when I get back to this point about vulnerability reporting, is when you report something, you don't want to just drop it on your desk like a bomb. You don't want to just basically say, here is my problem, go do something with it. You want to deliver it kind of in a soft fashion. You want to basically say, this is what I found, here are some solutions. And one of the issues is when you drop bombs, no one wants to get near it. So it's going to get a slow reaction. So if there's a way that you can basically report a vulnerability with a solution, you'll end up getting more of a reaction out of people because then they have a path forward. And being able to communicate that, getting the soft skills that tech people typically don't necessarily have very well refined is one of those things we talked about in the previous panels, is something that you give the developer, gives you a lot more in the way of reporting lever. Sorry for the small print here, this is mainly a background slide. So, get to the crux of it is, I come from Inspector General's office. They're in a very unique position because they're congressional, they're U.S. Code, Inspector General's Act of 1978. That gives us our authority that we have oversight. Most agency inspector generals only look at the agency. The HHS one also looks externally, so we look at other healthcare providers, hospitals, and so forth. But in general, that we have that oversight of the agency. So we have that ability to kind of look at all the operations, see what they're doing, and report on it. We also have an enforcement capability, so if we do find something, we can actually tag it, track it, audit it, and ensure that it gets done. And if it doesn't get done, we actually can perform criminal prosecution on it. But also, as part of the enforcement action is like, that gets reported up to Congress, and then as I mentioned before about them controlling budget, this is the kind of that lever that you don't want to use, but you can use it as a threat almost in a way. It's kind of a gray area that people are aware of it, but you don't want to use it, but you have the capability. It's like having that baseball bat that you want to use on someone. It's like, I could use this, but we could actually do this in a more civil fashion. And the other interesting thing about Inspector Generals is because they are usually an independent component of the agency, is that they do have a knowledge of the people to talk to. So we're talking about communication and trust, is they know exactly who to talk to, who may be the system owners, who may be the key people to talk to get a reaction.
Just a stupid question. Every department has
Every major agency has an inspector general. Some of the smaller components, like the Federal Trade Commission and so forth, may not have them, but may have a component that does oversight. But most agencies some agencies may only have a couple-person inspector general. They may not have a full IT organization, but there is usually a component, maybe an ombudsman as well, that serves that function somehow. No, most of the reporting for the Inspector General's offices either get reported to the agency head, but also concurrently to Congress or the White House on demand. We issue reports, so there are some that are based on kind of mission directives. We have our work plan of things that we're working on, like for us, it's the opioid epidemic, but others may have something else. Sort of, but let me get into that a little bit later. So we're talking about for vulnerability reporting. This seems like a really good lever. Hey, I've got enforcement, I've got oversight, and I have the ability to actually talk to people. So why not use the Inspector General's office to manage vulnerability reporting for federal agencies? Because, unlike DHS, you have the ability to, once a vulnerability is reported, it gets tracked. If you use the whistleblower hotline, most agency inspector generals have a whistleblower hotline or email address or reporting form, and you can throw that in there. It gets audited, tracked, and logged. And since that gets assessed, we can bring all that data in and start coordinating. If we see a bunch of vulnerabilities on a particular system, we can actually get something done. And unlike CERT or DHS, it's like you have that kind of micro view from macro level. You look across the agency, but we can also kind of focus specifically on that data. And we can start to see kind of clustering and stuff. And because of that authority and communication building within the agencies, we have the ability to get things done like that. Right now, it's not necessarily being done. We will do audits, but it's only what we find. We're not getting a chance to get folks from the outside. So many people are familiar with some of the bug bounty programs like DoD has had, and I think GSA's had one, and some other agencies have done it before. That's great, but it's usually a limited scope. Sometimes a citizen will trip across a government service and find a vulnerability just using, say, like DHS's immigration form. And how do you report a bug? You can report here, but there's no kind of follow-up method for that usually. There's no trackability. So using an IG and whistleblower framework would actually work in that case. So thinking about next steps, if you really want to kind of engage a little bit later, this could have been a 50-minute talk. That's why I'm kind of rushing through a lot of this stuff, so that's why I'm kind of trying to collect my thoughts properly. Engage in forums where they start talking about vulnerability reporting. So conferences such as this, like I mentioned, some friends out in Hull, the reason this got started was due to a dinner conversation among speakers at DEF CON. So this is literally just kind of fomenting the thoughts together. But if you get a chance to sit on the standards bodies, you have engagement with your congressional representatives, you bring this up. It's like, hey, we're trying to deal with vulnerabilities. DHS is overwhelmed. Hey, there's this other tool that we can use in our toolbox. Why not engage inspector generals to do that? If you are reporting to US CERT and aren't getting any traction, which is usually just a redirect to CERT CCF in Pittsburgh, where I used to work, try reporting to an IG. Give it a test fire. Report something in the whistleblower thing. The framework may not actually be able to handle that, but that would start the conversation. Like someone at my whistleblower office will come to me and is like, I have this thing that looks like a vulnerability report. Like, what do I do? And then be like, oh, well, I know exactly what you should be doing with this. And then work them through developing that process and policy. And again, talking about, if that doesn't work, engage your vendor or service provider that you know that they're using. So if you find an Oracle vulnerability that seems to be common across government use, try to work with the CERT-CC framework there with the US CERT vulnerability reporting, and also keep engaged with the vendor, because eventually the vendor's going to come to us as an agency and say, hey, someone reported this vulnerability. We know, as a customer of ours, there's some stuff you're going to need to fix. So it's kind of the slower way of doing it, but eventually we'll kind of boil up to us. And again, when you hire a legislator, when you vote a legislator, and it seems like we go more towards buying them, you can push them in those public forums and say, hey, vulnerability reporting process is an important thing for me. Can you do something about it? And really try to kind of drive that point home. You start at that, well, then they start developing a policy and a way forward. Final note here. I know I tease everybody with the vulnerabilities equities process. The caveat, the tie-in of this one is you report a new vulnerability. There's no guarantee when you report it to DHS that it's not going to get turned around to the intelligence community or anybody else and then stockpiled. This may kind of take that out of that realm a little bit. So it kind of keeps the government a little bit more honest because while we are a law enforcement component, most of the time the folks stalking the whistleblower hotline are not law enforcement, they're not intelligence community people, so there's a greater chance of your average IT person getting a chance to eyeball that before someone's going to go and stockpile it. So it increases the idea of the vulnerabilities equities process of being transparent. It kind of opens up the transparency of the loop by kind of removing the covers that typically some of the vulnerability reporting framework currently has in place. Again, like I said, if you don't want your vulnerabilities being used as weapons, that's another route for that as well. If you have a question about reporting how it's being handled, do submit to CertCC. They've been doing this since 1988, handling the liaison between the vendors and the researchers and the government. I've worked with those guys. They're top-notch folks. They're honest. They have it in their heart to basically solve the technology issue. They don't deal with politics. They just want to make sure that we're safe. So at the very last, if you feel icky about reporting stuff to the government, report directly to them. It's kind of basically the best way. They've had a lot of skin in the game. Other than that, thank you very much. And I think we've got 2 minutes for